Hello, and welcome to the U.S. Institute of Peace and our webinar on India's perceptions of China's nuclear advancement. I'm Dan Markey, a senior advisor here at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and it's my pleasure to be joined by three great experts on this topic. The first is Dr. Rajeswari Rajagopalan, and she is the author of an important new USIP special report that we commissioned in an effort to better understand how India is thinking about and might respond to China's growing and improving nuclear arsenal. We know from U.S. Defense Department reports that China is not only adding to its total number of warheads in its arsenal, but that it's also made big and important strides in the quality and diversity of its delivery systems. And some believe that China may be shifting aspects of its doctrine as well. As far as we can tell, much of this effort appears directed at better deterring and competing with the United States. But in a world of nuclear-armed states, including India, we anticipate that changes in one arsenal could have downstream, perhaps even unintended, consequences for others. This was one of the analytical findings of a 2022 USIP Senior Study Group report on strategic stability in Southern Asia. Fortunately for us, Raji was willing to undertake some additional research for us, and as she will explain, she devoted considerable time to interviewing a range of well-placed Indian experts and former policymakers. Raji is currently a resident senior fellow at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, or ASPI, where she joins us from Canberra today. Prior to joining ASPI, Raji was the director of the Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. Over her distinguished career, she has worked in and out of government and is the author, co-author, or editor of more than a dozen books. Today, Raji will explain her top-line findings, and then we'll get responses from two additional colleagues. First, we will hear from Robert Peters. Bob is currently a research fellow for nuclear deterrence and missile defense in the Heritage Foundation's Allison Center for National Security. Prior to joining Heritage, he worked in government at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, or DTRA, in other government, private sector, and research roles. Second, we'll hear from Dr. Samir Lalwani, a senior expert, and I'm happy to say, my colleague here at the United States Institute of Peace. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. He's a prolific researcher and writer, and prior to joining USIP, he served as the director of the South Asia program at the Stimson Center. So we clearly have all the necessary ingredients for an outstanding discussion of what I think is a very important topic. After each of our speakers make opening remarks, I will moderate a conversation to draw them out on various related issues. For our audience joining online, I would encourage you to ask questions in the chat window on the USIP website page, and other USIP colleagues will be collecting those questions and sharing them with me so that I can ask them of our panelists later. So without further ado, let's get going. Raji, over to you for your thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dan. Good morning, good evening to everyone joining from the US and Australia. It's great to be part of this conversation today. Thanks, Dan, for putting this together. For me, it's a huge sense of relief to have this report out because it took about 3 years since I started the work. I was initially planning to rely on a lot of the secondary sources, including Indian scholarly work on China's nuclear expansion. But once I began the research, I came to realize the huge gap in Indian literature. There was literally nothing other than a few opinion pieces on China's nuclear expansion, to the point where I had to change the methodology to an interview-based work, where I interviewed recently retired military officials, including former strategic force commanders, military chiefs, former diplomats who have dealt with China and nuclear issues, including former NSAs, national security advisors, and other scholars in the Indian think tank community. Again, all of them were willing to share their perspectives on what they thought to be the rationale for China's nuclear expansion, how India might respond, and the broader consequences of China's nuclear expansion. And close to 3 years after I started the work on this report, there is still no new literature in India that tries to explain the Indian position or the Indian options in the face of China's nuclear expansion. So I'm really glad to have this report out and hope it generates some debates within India among the policymakers. And I think it's also required in the broader Indo-Pacific context as well. I see in Canberra, there is a very little Australian debate on China's nuclear expansion, modernization. So I think there is a greater need for this conversation to happen across the Indo-Pacific context. So I'm very thankful to Dan Markey and the entire USIP team, especially Brigitta, who helped me to get this report in its final shape. So this report, as Dan said, is an effort to provide an assessment of India's perceptions of China's nuclear expansion. We have seen massive expansion of China's nuclear forces, which has been sudden and unexplained in many ways because China has not really come up with any rationale explaining the growth, the massive expansion that we are seeing. And it has left many countries in the region and beyond to come up with an appropriate response. Because it's just unclear, like I said, why China has undertaken this significant expansion of its nuclear forces. The China Military Power Report of the U.S. Department of Defense of December 2024 stated that China is still continuing this expansion, and it expects that China will have over 1,000 nuclear warheads by the end of the decade. This is a dramatic development, considering that China for decades maintained a nuclear arsenal with around 300 nuclear warheads. And of course, China has not come up with any explanation or rationale, at least publicly, as to why this buildup. And there is also no endpoint to this expansion. Like, where is this heading? What is the goal of this expansion? Is it to reach a comparable size with the U.S. arsenal or Russian arsenal? So there's no clear understanding from the Chinese explanation from the Chinese side on any of these critical questions. Many around the world are concerned about the expansion, and the likely consequences. But I think it is India that's going to be likely the most affected by China's nuclear expansion. But like other countries, India is yet to come up with a decision on how it should respond. This is an important issue for India because India has held on to a nuclear philosophy somewhat similar to that of China, that looking at nuclear weapons from a political rather than military utility point of view. Therefore, stressing on a no first use doctrine with a relatively small nuclear arsenal. But if India's nuclear deterrence calculations change because of China's nuclear expansion, it will set in motion a series of actions. It will have an effect not only on Pakistan's nuclear force, but also potentially wider ramifications in the Indo-Pacific and global nuclear politics. To take one implication, for instance, Indian effort to keep up with the nuclear force in proportion to China, that could complicate any future arms control efforts and will also likely bring in other effects on nuclear stability itself. Therefore, studying India's thinking on China's nuclear expansion is particularly important, which is what I've tried to do in this USIP report. Indian government has not really come out with any statement on China's nuclear expansion, at least officially. But my interviews with former Indian military and civilian officials, as well as others from the strategic community, provide some sense of how official New Delhi may be thinking about its responses to China's nuclear expansion. I would say, despite the official silence and as well as the meager public reaction by the Indian strategic community, but the Indian government is taking China's nuclear expansion quite seriously. During my interviews, I also got to hear how India has been monitoring China's nuclear forces closely, and there is some indication that Indian officials may have been aware of certain internal Chinese debates about nuclear expansion for some time. This came out, maybe I'm thinking there is no date yet, but from the interviews, I got the sense that this may have been around the late 2000s. This assessment, India seemed to have shared with, at least with Russia. I don't know which are the other countries that it has been shared with. As in other capitals, there is little consensus about what is driving China's nuclear expansion, with possible reasons ranging from China's desire to become a global power by 2049 to competition with the US, concerns about the US missile defense system, and its effects on China's second strike capability. But some of the more interesting questions that came up during the writing of this report is what impact will the expansion of China's nuclear arsenal have on China's NFU doctrine? The general Indian consensus appears to be that China will continue to maintain its NFU status, though Indian analysts also expect that China will broaden the definition of NFU to permit a variety of nuclear operations, including potentially launch on warning capabilities. The expectation is that over time, an expanding Chinese nuclear arsenal will lead to contradictions with the NFU doctrine, leading to a dilution of the NFU. Nevertheless, Indian analysts maintain, or at least they don't expect China to give up on NFU as a formal position because the doctrine provides China with some diplomatic and normative benefits as a responsible stakeholder and so on and so forth. Though there is also some concerns that China may learn from Russia's successful effort at deterring Western involvement in Ukraine, with loose talk about the use of nuclear weapons. And China could be expected to make similar threats in a contingency involving Taiwan. That would require China to change or move into a Russian-style first use doctrine. So we don't know where that is going to be leading to in a sense. Surprisingly, despite some concerns about China's possible abandonment of the NFU, there is little support for India to move away from the NFU, though support for India's NFU itself fairly is lukewarm. Understandably, the sense was that it was the Indian military that was the most uncomfortable with the NFU, as it is essentially a reactive posture. But many others supported it precisely for that reason, in a sense. So despite these differences, generally, there was little enthusiasm for abandoning the NFU policy entirely, especially since the NFU could itself be stretched to accommodate a variety of options, including launch and warning, as China appears to be doing. Overall, the sense was that the current Indian NFU posture was robust and dynamic enough and does not require any changes. As regards the specifics of China's nuclear expansion and the issues of particular concern to India, the focus was almost entirely on the land-based missile systems such as the DF-41 and a potential hypersonic glide vehicle based on that missile. Equally, Indian analysts were concerned about a potential dual-use system, essentially missiles that could carry both a conventional or a nuclear warhead, which leads to possible problems of distinguishing between them. Indian analysts were particularly concerned about the DF-26, which, again, because of its high accuracy and the dual-use nature, could potentially be a dangerous counterforce weapon. China's decision to put all long-range missiles under the PLA rocket forces added to these concerns. Indian analysts seemed less concerned with China's sea-based deterrent, and even less so about China's air-based deterrent force, because these were seen as old and technologically inferior. But again, I have to note here that these interviews were conducted much before much of the information about China's new stealth bomber prototypes, H-20 and the JHXX, came out. So in the interviews mostly were aware of the H-20, but they mostly saw it as a vanity project that China did not have the capacity to build. But today, if I were to conduct this interview, I think they may have a very different sense of how it is going about. In my interview, there were also significant differences between the Indian analysts on China's nuclear capabilities, with some being even outright skeptical about whether it even had a triad, considering the weakness in the sea-based leg of the nuclear force. But I think that also has undergone some changes. Disagreements were also about why China has embarked on its massive nuclear expansion. There were also disagreements about the importance of some of the institutional changes that China has undertaken, such as the creation of the PLA rocket force or the PLA strategic support force. Again, these interviews were conducted before the termination of the strategic support force in April 2024. With many of, at least some of the interviews, seeing these institutional innovations as important, but seeing that at the end of the day, the Chinese civilian leaders were in control of the situation, irrespective of the institutional changes. On questions of how India should respond, again, there were fundamental disagreements with some feeling that India should build up its nuclear arsenals, while others were much more sanguine about the consequences of China's nuclear buildup. This, in a sense, mirrors some of the opinions among experts in other countries as well as to how they should respond to China's action, with some taking it as a threat requiring much more robust response than others. Those who were concerned about China's nuclear expansion pointed out that China could have more than 1,000 warheads by the end of the decade, and that could potentially lead to a more aggressive Chinese behavior against India across the border, even in conventional terms. There were also questions about, others noted that the explosive yields of China's nuclear warheads were far higher, again, referring to some of the old controversy about whether Indian hydrogen bomb tests were successful in 1998. There was an outlier opinion which went on to suggest that India's deterrent itself could be called to question as a result of China's nuclear expansion. The Indian analysts, those who were sanguine about what mattered, were not the numbers involved in China's expansion, but rather the qualitative advances that China was making. Again, India's response, therefore, they felt it should focus on the quality of its nuclear force, such as the range of its missiles, better submarine-based deterrent force, and superior MIRV technology, and so on and so forth. But irrespective of the disagreements, there was consensus across the interviews that India needed to respond in some fashion. This ranged from relatively benign responses, such as reviewing India's nuclear force posture, to much radical ones, such as a small number, but resuming nuclear testing and even revising the NFU posture. All of this suggests that India will respond in some manner, but given the risk-averse nature of the Indian leadership and generally conservative approach to nuclear policy, it is unlikely. For example, Prime Minister Modi, first when he campaigned, he talked about revising the NFU, but this was quickly averted, and he, in fact, altered the viewpoint to say that we will be reviewing the NFU once he came into office. So it's unlikely that India will radically revise its nuclear force or resume nuclear testing unless others started testing first. U.S. responses were also an important consideration, though there were differences about how Indian analysts felt about the likelihood of U.S. response to any change in nuclear policy. Some felt that the U.S. would understand if India expanded its nuclear arsenal or resumed testing, especially if Indian weapons did not target the U.S., while others were somewhat less certain about it, but there was clear consensus that India should engage with the U.S. While considering its response. So there is very little doubt that India is concerned about China's nuclear expansion, especially because of the confrontation at the border since the summer of 2020, and the various political disagreements with China, and the overall the tone and tenor of the relationship between India and China. It's quite likely that the Indian concerns will continue to grow if the Chinese arsenal continues to expand beyond the currently expected even 1,000 warheads. So therefore, I think this is something that is going to stay with India and will continue to monitor for a while before it actually takes a clear position on the expansion and how it should respond. Let me stop there, and I look forward to hearing others' thoughts and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Raji. Great start, and definitely set the table for lots of questions and thoughts. And you also captured a lot of what was in the report, but not everything. And we'll leave it to our other discussants to draw you out on certain points. So on that, let me first turn to Bob.
Great, thanks. And Raji, thanks for writing the great report. I thought there's a lot of really critical insights there, and so congratulations to you, and thanks to USIP for having me. What strikes me is that India today has a strategic dilemma. It's facing two nuclear-armed actors that are capable of holding key at-risk population centers in India with little to no tactical warning. And given the partnership between Pakistan and China, it's very possible that a conflict with one could drag the other into a war, forcing India into not only deterring two actors simultaneously, which is its challenge today, a similar challenge that the United States has with China and Russia, but potentially war fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously with nuclear weapons. And so I think this is going to be the challenge for India's strategic policymakers to really grapple with over the coming 10 decades. Raji correctly pointed out that China is the fastest growing nuclear power on the planet today. This is unlikely to change over the next 5 years, given their trajectory. We in the United States are grappling with what do we do in response to this Chinese nuclear breakout? But the other big question is, what will India do in response, given the growing partnership between Beijing and Islamabad, and the fact that the lack of action in the strategic sphere, whether that's lack of action in the United States or in Europe or in India, is causing the world's democracies to incur greater amounts of strategic risk, as we see the autocrats increasingly investing in both long-range fires, that is, ballistic missiles that can carry nuclear warheads. Raji, you mentioned China's no first use policy in place today. I would offer that in American defense policy circles, it's increasingly a held belief that China's no first use policy is not issued in good faith. That where it may have had some merit 6 decades ago, most defense policymakers in DC dismissed the Chinese no first use policy out of hand as being non-credible. When you look at where is China going to be investing in the systems, I think they're going to continue to invest heavily in land-based systems, but still retain a submarine force that's designed to be more of a secure second strike system than an actual nuclear warfighting capability. But even as a secure second strike system, I think that's at risk. And the reason for that is because of U.S. dominance in anti-submarine warfare. To be honest, we are the best in the world at anti-submarine warfare, and the Chinese know this. And they likely know that the Americans have the ability to sink almost every submarine in the Chinese fleet on order. Their bomber, the Chinese bomber capability, is still nascent in comparison to American bomber capabilities. So for these reasons, I think China will continue to invest heavily in missile capabilities as a default, and that has obvious implications for India that Delhi's going to have to grapple with. So for me, the bottom line is we in Washington and Delhi have to engage in discussions about the Chinese breakout, because the same attributes that impact one nation is also impacting the other. A few other points I'll make before I turn it over to Samir. We, as well as the Indians, should be learning from the recent air defense performances of various U.S., Russian, and even Israeli systems. We've seen a number of recent missile engagements in the Ukraine war and Israel and the Gulf theaters over the past couple of years. And what we've seen is basically the Russian-made systems and the Russian knockoff systems are basically trash, and the Western-made systems are excellent. And so for India, given the air threat that it's going to be facing, that will be increasingly challenging in the coming years, I think India really needs to think hard about where it's going to put its investment dollars, given the performance of the various systems. Raji, you wrote in your report, quote, a more strategic reason for reducing the size disparity between Chinese and U.S. nuclear forces is the difficulty that the U.S. ballistic missile defense systems create for China's retaliatory forces, especially in the context of the U.S. withdrawal from the anti-ballistic missile and the intermediate range nuclear forces treaties and its development of missile defense systems and global strike capabilities. I would just say that current American ballistic missile capabilities are not optimized to engage Chinese missile threats, certainly not intermediate range or intercontinental range missile threats. But the irony is that the current Chinese nuclear breakout is, to my mind, the primary driver for why the United States is going to build a missile defense architecture, that, i.e. the Iron Dome for America, that will be, in fact, optimized to neutralize Chinese missile threats. In that sense, if the Chinese missile and nuclear breakout is because of fears of the U.S. missile defense architecture, then they themselves, the Chinese, have created a self-fulfilling prophecy. You also write that the assumptions here appear to be that a larger nuclear arsenal comparable to that of Russia or the United States will lead China to adopt nuclear strategies similar to the Russian or U.S. strategies. I would offer that Russia and the U.S. have radically different strategies today, which is part of the reason why there's so much turmoil in the American nuclear field today. Russia seeks to deploy a nuclear warfighting capability, that is, all these kind of Baroque systems that are land attack systems, anti-ship capabilities, nuclear torpedoes, all this kind of like crazy stuff that the Russians have been flaunting for the last 15 years. Whereas we in the United States have largely divested of nuclear warfighting capabilities and just retain a nuclear deterrence arsenal. And we in Washington are paying the cost for this. And this is why we're having these discussions in DC. Do we need to expand the non-strategic nuclear arsenal? And so finally, I'll just close on, you have this line in this report. However, most interviewees held to the view that China sees nuclear weapons as political, not military weapons. It would be foolish to use them even in a Taiwan scenario, because doing so could potentially force a U.S. intervention. Broad consensus among not only the interviewees, but also other Indian analysts is that the main concern for India is not Chinese TNWs, tactical nuclear weapons, but the increase in intermediate, medium, and short-range missiles that target India. I would just offer, look, if they were only political weapons, China would not be building tactical nuclear weapons that are optimized in nuclear warfighting as they're doing now with the DF-21 and DF-26 that have land attack and nuclear anti-ship capabilities. And so I look at it, I put on my old DOD bureaucrat hat, and I look at the arsenal that they're fielding. It's not only deterrence arsenal, but it's actually a nuclear warfighting arsenal. And those are two very different things. And so for me, the bottom line is that India is actually underplaying the Chinese nuclear threat and the Chinese nuclear intentions. And I'll just close there.
Fantastic. You put a lot of good stuff on the table too. I'm sure Raji will want to respond to. So Raji, I hope you're taking good notes. But we're going to move over to Samir first and give him the floor, and then we'll come back to you so you can respond. Samir.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Raji, for a great paper. I really enjoyed reading it. And I came away with, I thought I'd sort of offer 3 observations based on reading the report that might sort of result in some questions, but then also maybe 2 suggestions for where you can take this, you or other scholars can take this next in terms of both research, but also sort of policy implications. So the first observation is actually about sort of collection and assessment. And you write in the paper that one former military official said that India does not have the means to monitor China's nuclear force modernization on its own. And that was really striking to me. Sort of for both, it's an understandable, concern, but I also was puzzled as to sort of what exactly are the shortfalls in means. Are we talking about actual collection capabilities and assets? Are we talking about the assessment process? Or is it that both of those are present, but it's just not prioritized relative to other threats that India has to deal with, whether it's on its western borders or internally? But I do recall this is a familiar refrain. We heard this a lot in 2020 when India, faced off against the Chinese on the border, and there were significant casualties for the first time in 50 years. And then coming out of that discussion, that event, there was a lot of discussion about India's intelligence failures, right? And again, there was a little bit of debate between whether this was, again, collection, persistent, observation, or whether this was an assessment failure. But still one that I think, if it's recurring, is one that India would probably want to think about remedying. For the United States, I recall, and there's probably sort of many moments of this, but maybe, and Bob will have sort of other ones, but I recall the fractional orbital bombardment system launch test that the Chinese did, I want to say in 2021, was kind of like referred to as a Sputnik moment for the US. And I wonder what would precipitate sort of a similar effect for India, both in terms of prioritization of collection, but then sort of focus on the challenge. I'd be interested to, if you have thoughts on sort of what the people in India's intelligence community, what they are seeking to do to remedy this, if they are looking for more means of collection, if they even sort of just start pursuing more classified assessments of open source materials, and sort of what possibilities there are for India to sort of get ahead of that curve. The second point I thought I'd make is kind of related, and it's that sort of the broad conclusion of India not being overworked about sort of Chinese nuclear developments is actually, I think, kind of consistent with a number of other patterns in Indian assessment of China, right? So, I think that this relates to some level of Indian defense discourse focusing on platforms rather than campaigns or military effects. I see a lot of analysis of, what Chinese systems they have, the quantity of them, the quality of them in terms of sort of different generations, but not really sort of like how they play in an actual military conflict. And, I think sort of like some examples that come to mind are like on the space counter-space debates on Chinese sort of anti-ship ballistic missiles, but also short-range ballistic missiles that I think can have profound effects in a border conflict with India. Even Bob referred to this, but long-range precision fires and sort of that combination with drones. Like there doesn't seem to be sort of a whole lot of diagnosis of like what that means for a Chinese campaign, specifically against India. There's possibly a couple hypotheses as to sort of why I think there's some sort of shortfall in that discourse. I mean, one might be that just the lack of jointness within the services or within the military, and the lack of theaterization means that you sort of just think of things on a service by service basis, platform by platform basis, rather as an integrated military effect. But I also wonder if the other explanation could be that there's some level of thinking that the India-China contingencies that are plausible for most Indian strategists and policymakers are really limited to skirmishes on the border, like the ones we saw in 2020, like consequential, casualty-inducing, but not the level of war, and therefore not getting to the strategic level or strategic duration. And so those are just sort of hypotheses as to why that might be the case, but be interested in your thoughts on that. The third point is sort of maybe builds off something that Bob mentioned. There's a really interesting line that you referred to, sort of the China-Russia relationship. You said the Chinese buildup of forces is presumably happening with Russian assistance. And, I think that sort of comports with the DoD China Military Power Report, talking about co-developments or sort of, Russian support for Chinese missile early warning systems, for enrichment and reprocessing, for HEU nuclear fuel, for highly enriched uranium nuclear fuel. So all these areas are areas where you see sort of the Chinese nuclear arsenal developing out of Russian support. And I wonder, I mean, for the United States, I mean, there's a clear, logic to this, or a clear sort of implication for this. But as the India-China relationship grows more competitive, if not more adversarial, what does this mean for India-China cooperation, or sorry, India-Russia cooperation, right? There was like a period of time when that may have been a little bit rocky. It seems like, given in the last year, you've sort of had a rejuvenation of that strategic relationship. Bob referred to the sort of the Russian air defense systems, the S-400s, that are still being onboarded by the Indians. Some new surface combatant ships just got delivered. There's talk of India leasing another Russian nuclear submarine for attack submarine. So does the Russia-China relationship give any pause to the pace or scope of the India-Russia relationship, or are these two things sort of like operating independently? I can imagine like sort of some strategic systems where you could see direct transmission from the Russians to the Chinese that would have an adverse impact on India's defense and security, on air defense systems where the vulnerabilities baked into them, on submarine technology development or co-development that has been at least reported in the open source domain. So those two areas, I'd be interested to sort of see, what whether if at a minimum sort of the halo effect of sort of the Chinese nuclear developments are having an impact on Indian strategic planning when it comes to its other partners and allies. The last point I make is about sort of future directions that I think you could take this. One is sort of a research question. I noticed in the sampling of your interviews, it's concentrated on retired senior military, retired senior foreign service, national security officials, really invaluable sources of technocratic sort of assessment and information. But I'd be interested as to what the civilian political view of China's nuclear buildup is, right? Because at the end of the day, they're the ones in charge. India, for all its sort of challenges, has a very sort of dominant civilian architecture over all policymaking and national security decision making. So, and they're also more sensitive to public opinion. So this also brings into question what is Indian public opinion on China broadly and its nuclear buildup specifically. So I think that would be a fruitful area of further research to see whether the same uncertainties or hesitations carry forward to the civilian take on China's nuclear buildup. So the second implication I think that's interesting is a policy one, which I think you're alluding to, but it seems that we're at a point where we need a U.S.-India nuclear deterrence and proliferation dialogue. I think it's typically been done either sort of as a sort of finger waving, like non-proliferation exercise, but I wonder if we should be having something on the order of what we have with the British and the French, which is a sort of a strategic deterrence dialogue. That may be less relevant to the Indo-Pacific. Our Indo-Pacific sort of allies that we talk to on this stuff, like Japan and ROC, like South Korea, we have advanced dialogues, but they're also very asymmetric relationships. So I wonder if the time is right for kind of a dialogue between the U.S. and India, both on assessment as well as sort of planning and strategy. But I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thanks, Samir. Great points as well. Raji, I will let you pick up on the pieces of their comments that you would most like to tackle, but I would observe that across the board, what I hear is a message fairly loud and clear that perhaps your Indian interviewees and others in New Delhi and elsewhere need to be taking this threat from China a little bit more seriously and more urgently, and considering some of the specific ways that maybe right now they have a greater confidence about their ability to handle China, deter China, that their read on China is too sanguine by maybe a lot. And so I wonder what you make of that and whether you could imagine that, if you were to conduct these interviews again now or in a couple of years, whether you see this shifting. But I'll leave it to you to pick up on what you'd most likely to cover.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Bob and Samir, for I think excellent questions, comments, your thoughts on the broader subject of China's nuclear expansion and where we are, how we are dealing with it, how we are responding to it. It is the most significant threat, and I think everybody has been underestimating, including the U.S. in public debate, but also certainly India has been underselling this whole point about China becoming much more aggressive, much more adopting much more riskier options, options in terms of the threats, in terms of how. And I think I take the point first on the whole. The Chinese rationale for at least how the Indian interviews talk to me about how China uses the missile defense, the U.S. missile defense shield as a sort of a logic for China's nuclear expansion because it complicates their own second strike capability. I think China uses it as it's an excuse. It's a logic that China has conveniently found. It finds certain amount of legitimacy in using that particular U.S. missile defense as an excuse. But otherwise, China is hell bent on moving forward in terms of the growth of its arsenal. Again, comparable to U.S., Russia, and so on and so forth. And I think that's precisely the reason why in the last several years there have been calls on China to join some of the arms control processes, bilateral or trilateral fashion involving U.S. and Russia. But China has always walked away saying that is not going to happen because China's nuclear arsenal is fairly small and that it is not in a position to join any of these kind of some sort of an arms control or even sort of a nuclear dialogue in a sense. And one key question that comes out of that is, okay, if China is looking at some sort of a parity with the U.S. and Russian forces in terms of the size, maybe not for a number one for one kind of thing, but somewhat the size is some comparable, that kind of a parity, would China also walk away? Again, that relates to the point that Bob said about the Russian and the U.S. nuclear strategies are very different. But even so, my bigger question that I want to pose is China also going to adopt similar posture in a sense? Would it walk out of China had a smaller arsenal, China had has an NFU policy, but all of these policies came about at a very different time when China had a very small arsenal and they wanted certain amount of sort of a luxury and comfort in knowing that adopting this NFU policy gives me that kind of a security. So from the US or others or Russia's and so on and so forth. But today, I don't know whether the same logic should continue to explain the Chinese arsenal and us trying to make sense of the Chinese nuclear expansion. I don't think those logic that applied in the 70s and 80s and 90s should hold us today as well. We need to move forward. In this particular report that I did, I think I was trying to get most of the other Indian interviews, how they perceive this expansion. Not a lot of my own inputs. I did bring in my inputs, by my own thoughts in this, but I think it was primarily I was trying to sort of convey as to how much of the Indian military officials, as well as Indian civilian officials who are former diplomats and others, and some members from the Indian strategic community thought about these issues in a sense. But I do agree that we are not giving it the kind of attention that it requires, the kind of importance. We are still it needs immediate and urgent attention, serious attention, but I don't think we are giving that. We are too sanguine about this in a sense. A lot of the logic that I heard from the Indian side, whether it is the US pulling out of the ABM, but the Chinese have been developing the short and medium range missiles for a longer time in a sense. In fact, that is one of the first developments that actually pushed India to do its nuclear test in 1998. So in a sense, China has been progressing on those missile developments much faster in recent years. So I think that's an issue that we need to continue. I think India, Japan, and countries like Vietnam are also concerned about I agree again entirely with how the short-range, intermediate-range ballistic missile IRBMs for the regional deterrent purposes that China has developed, the DF-21, DF-26, that continue to be serious, raising serious questions for India. Again, I don't have any sort of a disagreement with that, but I agree with the point that we need to be taking the Chinese nuclear expansion and modernization a lot more seriously, and not to take the Chinese their explanation or some sort of the logic that many Indian interviews found in Chinese literature or in their conversation that this is because the US has done this that we need to respond to it. It is this particular US activity or this particular issue that's kind of, so I think I think India needs to get more realistic about how it looks at the Chinese nuclear modernization and so on and so forth. On some of the summaries points, the first question, I think that's a legitimate, very important one. Is it the collection of information intel issue, or is it an assessment failure that we continue to see? Again, you related to the 2020 development. Again, 2020 development also, I think we are looking, when we look at China or any of the threat scenario, we look at things in a very linear fashion and say, okay, this is the usual pattern that we see. Nothing unusual is going to happen, which is what exactly happened with the 2020 Galwan crisis. The Chinese were engaged in their annual exercise in that particular part of the Tibet Autonomous Region, but very quickly they were able to move away from there to the Galwan because they already had the US, the PLA Army, Navy, Army and the Air Force in the region. They were able to quickly, and this given the COVID-19 pandemic, and India did not have adequate number of forces on the border to monitor that on a continuous basis. They did see them initially, but then they said, okay, this is the part of their annual exercise, nothing more, so we can move on. They dismissed that as just a normal annual exercise and nothing more. And I think that's, again, so is it a part of a failure in terms of collecting that having that continuous vigilance, continuous monitoring, and coming to the correct assessment? I think it's a mix of both, in a sense, both the collection. But specifically on China's nuclear modernization, again, India, I think, continues to rely on Western assessment, Western sources of information, which are credible. If you go by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and others that are also, especially in the some of the recent revelations about China's missile silos, these are all also based on the satellite imagery and so on and so forth. So Indian assessment also has looked at other US sources including the DoD China military power report and others reports. But I think India has always felt a lot more comfortable looking at reports like that comes from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, has taken them as much more credible, much more authentic in a sense. But having said that, I would say during the interviews, I did at least from a couple of two different officials, I also heard about the Indian assessment that India had developed internally, which talked about which referred to some of the Chinese debates about the need to expand China's nuclear forces. So this was well before the U.S. report started talking about the Chinese military modernization. So in a sense, I would think generally when I talked to the interviews, I got the sense that they all continue to rely on the U.S. and the Western sources for information on China's nuclear modernization. But at the same time, at least two officials were able to talk. So I don't know whether that was there's a periodic exercise within the Indian government to monitor, come up with these kind of reviews of where China is heading, or was it a sort of a one-off kind of an exercise that they did at some point because there was a good intel report or somebody who was based in China. I don't know, maybe a combination of factors provided for that government to come up with that kind of an assessment internally at that point of time. But because I have not heard of such similar reports on a regular basis within the Indian establishment, so I'm not, and I've been part of the system for a very relatively short time, but for about 5 years, and I really did not see a lot of that coming through seriously well-considered assessment on the Indian side in a sense. So I'm not sure where we, so I would think India needs to step up its kind of capabilities in collating, monitoring this on a regular basis and coming up with the assessment. And that's also, that actually ties up with that other point about your last point. Is it time for a U.S.-India nuclear and deterrence kind of a dialogue? Yes, and I think this again came through the interviews as well, who very clearly said that, and many actually said that we already have maybe not a separate dialogue, but part of the U.S.-India strategic dialogue is possibly where this is being addressed. But apparently Indian side does kind of engage the U.S. on these issues on a fairly regular basis. But I think this needs to be sort of institutionalized more in terms of having a separate dialogue format. I think that's something that we need to do. And have we reached in terms of, is it comparable to the kind of dialogues that you have with the UK and France? I don't think so. So I think that's where you need to look at where we go. But I think that's something we need to kind of work on in a sense. Again, your second point, I'm not in disagreement that India focuses on, what systems that have been developed, systems and platforms that have been developed, but how it is going to play out in a particular during a conflict, and how it is going to be, how integration of multiple systems come together to have a much more cumulative, much more impactful sort of an effect. I don't think India is looking at that sense in a sense. And not in this, again, India and Southern Asia very well. So again, generally India believes that whatever threat and challenges that China poses for India, India can manage on its own, and India has all the capabilities that is required. But I think that's a very self-fulfilling prophecy that India has everything in place. We know what the threat is. We know how to manage them, how to address them. Part of the problem may be the lack of military-civilian interface. So how much of the military inputs do come in? I think this has been a complaint at least since the late 90s. I've been hearing, especially during the Kargil War. Then Chief of Army General V.P. Malik talked about it a lot, and he wrote a book about highlighting many of these issues. The lack of sufficient conversation dialogue between the civil military, I think that continues to be an issue. It has improved to some extent, but I think there is still under appreciation for that military perspective to come through for Indian government, the civilian leadership, to understand the gravity of the situation, the gravity of the threats that are coming from China in a sense. Very interesting points on China-Russia relationship and the kind of assistance that Russia provides China, especially the early warning systems. And I think that's where China comes with a certain amount of confidence to say that we can move on to an early launch on warning posture, on launch attack posture. All of that comes from the fact that of course, they do have they've developed a series of sophisticated satellite imagery, satellite-based sources, as well as sensors. They have strengthened all of that, but it also comes from the fact that Russians are providing Chinese with excellent assistance in terms of early warning systems. That is. India should be, again, I wish India would look at this in a bit much more clinical fashion, a much more practical, sort of pragmatic fashion, in a realistic way. But I think when it comes to Russia, India seems to be looking at it from a very historically how things are played a bit between India and Soviets, and therefore there is a certain amount of comfort level that is kind of driving the Indian approach when it comes to dealing with Russia. Because otherwise, going by a lot of the developments, I would not continue to rely on Russia today. To give you, at least since 2013, 2014, when the Crimea invasion happened, since then, I can see a lot many more strategic developments that has direct implications for India. It does affect India, the India-China military balance, for instance, at the border and elsewhere. The fact that India has bought the Su-30 platforms and from Russia and is deployed on the India-China border. But the fact that the Russians have supplied China with even more sophisticated, advanced platforms like the Su-35 has direct implications for India. India's military equations with military balance with China. Similarly, selling the Chinese with advanced kilo class submarines. All of that has implications on the border and elsewhere on the maritime front as well. So it seems unclear as to why India would continue to rely on Russia, and then especially after the Russian invasion has started on Ukraine. There has also been the military officials in the Indian armed forces are really unhappy with the Russians because they have faltered on all the spares, supply of spare parts, supply of the S-400 air defense system. On all of those things, there have been delays, and there is not even a timeline as to when Russia would be able to provide these to India, because whatever they're producing, that goes into the Russian military. Despite that, India has gone and signed more military deals even in recent months. To me, it seems like Russia is a card that they would like to play when things get difficult with the US or with the West in general. This, again, I would say, for instance, the issue with the Niger killing in Canada and the Panun issue in the US, which led to an indictment in New York, and putting India, essentially India's engagement in extraterritorial killings and such kind of activities has led to serious difficulties between India and the US in the last few months. The fact that former President Biden canceled his trip to India for the India's Republic Day celebrations a couple of years ago now, or last year, again, led to some very difficult moments for India to kind of, understand. And immediately, India's reaction was to send its foreign minister, Dr. Jaishankar, to Russia. And where he had a meeting with Putin, and he actually tweeted out to say, I had a greatest honor to meet with President Putin, whose guidance, I took his guidance and so on. So it seems like the role that Russia will continue to play, I don't think India is going to abandon Russia, because this is the value that it is going to play. It may not be so much in other terms, in material terms, like in terms of defense capabilities. There may be things that will not come in terms of nuclear submarine lease. All of that may be possible, may not work out. But I think the value that Russia provides to India is, you want to play difficult with India? When in terms of the US or other Western partnerships, it'll always say, we have Russia, one of our oldest strategic, continued reliable partner in a sense. So I think that's a strategic value that Russia will continue to play in India's national security approach in a sense. So it's not going to give up on that. But if I were a national security official in the higher realm, I would think twice, 10 times about how much I want to engage Russia in a sense. So it does not really, because things are not working in my favor. So I don't know. I'm not very clear as to why I would want to continue to kind of rely. Again, no disagreement on the next point about doing maybe a follow-up study at some stage in terms of understanding the civilian perspective. But I think that's for the future, and I will continue to look at that. Take maybe too much time. Let's go back there.
No, it's great. And of course, yes, there is more work to be done, and perhaps by you, Raji. So we'll keep that in mind. I wanted to first remind our online audience that you're welcome to write questions in the chat section. We're already starting to receive some of those, and I'm going to pivot to those very soon. But I did want to pick up on at least 2 or 3 specific issues and give each of you a chance to respond. The first one of these has to do with the interconnectedness of various nuclear developments and capabilities. But the specific thing I wanted to probe is the question of nuclear testing. Something that comes up in the report, the number of questions about whether India would in fact determine that it needed to conduct nuclear tests, what it anticipates might be a reaction to that, and so on and so forth. And Bob, you've written recently about concerns that you actually have about where the United States may be under some pressure to use nuclear tests, particularly in a crisis type of scenario, an attempt at deterrence. So you've obviously given a lot of thought to the role, utility, downside risks, and consequences of testing. So how did you interpret how India sees nuclear tests? How do you imagine, say, the United States might actually respond if India were to go ahead with tests? And how might others respond if India were to do so?
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, in the American context, I mean, we conducted over 1,000 tests during the Cold War. And so we basically got all the data that we need to ensure that we have an arsenal that's safe, secure, and reliable for the old warheads. Now, there's some discussion as to whether or not, as we build new warheads for the 21st century, whether or not we'll have to restart testing, or whether or not we have to test some warheads, because we have not done is tested warheads that were assembled 35 years ago to see if their performance is affected simply by degradation and over time. You know, what I've said is there could come a day in which an adversary in Beijing or Pyongyang or Moscow tries to engage in nuclear coercion against the United States or an American ally, and even employs a nuclear weapon to include an explosive nuclear yield. An American president may say, I want to respond in kind in order to show that the United States will not be coerced and it will not back down, and that the adversary can't escalate their way out of a crisis or an acute conflict. And in that sense, you want to give the president the option, no matter who's in the Oval Office, of being able to conduct a nuclear explosive test. And according to GIO, it's going to take us about 3 years in order to get the Nevada test site ready to rock and roll. And so my view is, if you actually want to optimize the president's ability to respond, you actually have to give him or her all the tools that they need. Some people say, well, then you could have other countries say, well, since the United States is testing, we've got the ability to test ourselves. I'm not sure that's the case. Like, I'm not sure that Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin, really want to test, and boy howdy they would, but we're not for those darn Americans. But once the Americans tested, then they'd feel the ability to go and test without having world opprobrium come down upon them. I just don't think that's the case. I think if they see that it is in their benefit to test, that they will do so. India and Pakistan tested in the late 1990s without really paying much of a cost, right? I don't think that they would pay much of a cost if they were to test again. I could understand if India decided to test as well, because they need to get the data to ensure that their arsenal is safe, secure, and reliable, or to ensure that they've got warheads that achieve the military requirements that are laid out by their leadership. There would be some finger wagging. There may even be some modest sanctions, but I think at the end of the day, the United States would look at it and say India is doing what it deems to be within their national interest. And it'll say, are we really going to walk away from a potential partnership with the world's largest democracy on the continent of Asia because they conducted some nuclear tests? Now, all that's going to be dependent upon who's sitting in the Oval Office at that moment, who's in Congress, and so forth. But I don't see that as being like, a hard break between Washington and Delhi if India decided to test. If India did decide to test, would China test? Maybe. But again, I go back to like the autocrats are going to do what they deem is in their interest, and they don't much care what the democracies say or do.
Great, thank you. Raji, I see did you want to jump in or?
Yeah, if I can make a quick comment on that. Of course, if an odd country like North Korea or Iran is going to do a test, I think India will not respond. But if there is going to be a nuclear test done by China, Pakistan, or even the US, I think it would give India an opportunity to validate or put to rest some of the controversy within India on India's nuclear test in 1998, especially the hydrogen bomb testing in a sense. So it might take that as an opportunity. But India, I don't think will be the first to start nuclear testing at all. But I think if there is a momentum that comes from China, Pakistan, the US, I think that would provide India with an opportunity to validate its hydrogen bomb test and credentials in a sense. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, no, that supports the distinction that Bob's making between India and the United States, where the United States may not need it technically in the same way that India may.
Yeah.
I want to shift over to Samir. I don't know if you have thoughts on this particular issue, but I also wanted to give you the floor again to speak a little bit more about what you might have in mind for the U.S.-India relationship. You talked about a dialogue on these issues, so talk would be good and seems like it would make a lot of sense. We have a lot of common concerns, and we probably have some questions we'd like to raise. But you've done a lot of work on the conventional defense cooperation between the United States and India. I wonder, if you wanted to think maybe expansively, push the envelope a little bit, if you were beginning to think about ways in which India and the United States saw the nuclear threat from China similarly. Are there things that might be worth considering there beyond just talk or steps after talk?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of scope for these kinds of conversations to happen. And Raj, you pointed out that they do happen, certainly at a track 2 level, even some track 1.5s. That I'm not sure they're as advanced at the gov to gov level, including like Strategic Forces Command and Stratcom and others. And so I guess I'm suggesting, though, I think it would be useful to elevate this a little bit. And one way to do that is, we have this upcoming bilateral defense framework that is in the process of being renegotiated and signed, hopefully this year. It'll be a 10-year framework. I mean, that covers the gamut of, sort of like defense technical and technology relationships. It's sort of a high-level political framework. It's got maritime security elements. There's sort of newer ones that have come along. I see no reason why you can't put a strategic component in there, and strategic meaning, nuclear capabilities, and maybe even sort of, advanced domains, right? There's even an advanced domain dialogue. Maybe that sort of gets integrated and we start talking about space and undersea and ASW, but also sort of nuclear capabilities. And I think the utility here would be a combination of sharing with each other our assessments of adversary capabilities and sort of trends, but also talking through scenarios, right? And I think for better or worse, like the nuclear dialogues sort of tend to sort of force the issue of considering a scenario and how it all plays out, because you have to look to escalation dynamics and how it sort of pushes up against strategic thresholds. So I think it's even if there's some sensitivities on sort of the nuclear discussions and sort of even areas like testing, I think there's utility in that broader strategic framework for discussion. On space, for example, again, I worry that there's not an advanced enough thinking. I mean, I think the United States is catching up on this. I'm not sure where India is on like Chinese counter space capabilities, not just like, kinetic direct ascent, kill like ASAT kills, but also we're talking about sort of on orbit satellites that can take out sort of communications or PNT satellites, electronic warfare, directed energy sort of attacks. So I think all those things could be critical in a war, but also in peacetime for India. And so those kinds of conversations, I think, would be a lot of utility in exchange at a track one level.
Raji, I want to give you a chance to respond to that just in terms of what you think the market would bear back in New Delhi. In other words, what's the appetite among Indian policymakers for having what are obviously pretty sensitive conversations that would be layered atop already somewhat more advanced conversations in U.S. India defense cooperation, and what would enter space where, historically we've rarely dared to go. So I want to hear that. And then I also have a way I want to push this conversation a little bit, which is, Samir just used the word scenarios. Our entire conversation so far, and really your report, is driven by the logic of capabilities more than the logic of scenarios. Yeah. And I think you make the point that, most Indian policymakers, most U.S. policymakers and analysts don't see an India-China conflict as a high probability, at least one that escalates to the nuclear level as high probability, even though the relationship has seen some pretty rocky times over the past few years. So I guess I'd like to know, as you or others think about how you might get from, people using bats and hitting each other in the high Himalayan ranges, how that somehow gets us, or some other conflict at sea or in space, could ever actually get us to an escalation that brings nuclear threats to the fore?
Fantastic points. Again, are we there yet in terms of raising the kind of conversation that we have at the government-to-government level, involving at some of the sensitive departments, strategic forces, command, STRATCOM? Maybe this is it's time for us to socialize the idea at a fairly senior level. I think there are some conversations that happen between the US and India at a track 1.5 level. I think it's time to socialize these ideas in those kind of platforms to see. I think India is warming up to those ideas. I think, again, a lot of what India does, India's comfort level has grown enormously when it comes to how much it deals, how much, and what are the areas that it deals with in terms of with its new security partners, the US, Japan, Australia, and so on and so forth. So I think India is warming up to that possibility very rapidly. And I think it all, again, thanks to China, mainly because India-China relations, like you said, have been through some rocky patches, and it does not seem like it is going to improve significantly. We may see a temporary sort of an arrangement. And of course, in October, you did see some border patrol management agreement, but that is not suggesting to me that things are changing fundamentally between India and China. The fundamental nature of the relationship, the conflict-oriented, the adversarial nature of India-China relations is not changing for the better anytime soon, because I think there are serious difficulties that both sides are unable to deal with. And this itself has not, that even the border patrol management agreement has not really led to disengagement of forces or redeployment of forces and so on and so forth. There are still something like 60,000 troops on each side of the border. We are still talking about fairly risky sort of scenarios when you look at it. Having said that, yes, scenarios, we have been still looking at capabilities, but I think we need to look at scenarios in which these capabilities will play out. And I think that's something that India has not been very adept at, but I think that's a US that has always been doing this scenario playing through a multiple simulation exercises, tabletop exercise, to see various contingencies, various scenarios to play out and see how you might respond, what are the kind of capability requirements that you need. I think that's a great way to kind of gain better understanding of at least having a realistic sense of how these threats play out. But I think India hasn't done that kind of an exercise on a regular basis, I would say. Maybe doing it off and on within the Indian Army, or the military forces maybe doing it amongst themselves. I don't know with what periodicity, but I think they do that. But I think, again, having a much more sort of a holistic sense of the all of government approach, I think that is something that is lacking on the Indian side. That needs to happen. And I think we have been, some folks have talked about it, sort of written about these things, saying that India needs to sort of get ahead in terms of gaining a better understanding of these issues, and that can only be done through TTX and simulation exercises. But I don't think there has been much of an effort from the Indian government side looking that in a big way. But I think very quickly on the on China's counter space capabilities, again, I entirely agree. Much of the focus has always been to the world itself, is been on the kinetic ASAT test, anti-satellite test, because you see that playing out there. But what China has been able to do in terms of on-orbit satelliting capabilities, essentially knocking out, if you're developing even purely defensive technologies, if you're developing a particular technology to remove a satellite and space junk that has been floating around, and you want to clean up outer space in a sense. What is the guarantee that the same technology that can be used to remove a piece of debris is not going to be used to knock out one of your satellites? Or other even simpler ways. Simpler ways are electronic warfare in space, cyber means. All of this have been on a rise, have seen exponential growth in the last, I think, 15 years or so. In fact, I did one of the longest paper reports for the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, precisely looking at China's, no, not China, but focusing on the electronic and cyber warfare in space, precisely to understand, because everybody talks about anti-satellite capabilities, but below that is less expensive, cheaper options, easy to access technologies. Electronic warfare, jamming a satellite, or using laser, these don't take money, but it's easily available. It's cheap. You can, you can knock out a satellite with relative ease and so on and so forth. India, I think on the counter space front, I think it's beginning to catch up. There's a lot of conversation that is happening. I was, for a very long time, I had the fear that India might not catch up to that debate at all. In fact, Indian military seem to have gone the other way around now suddenly in the last 5 years or so. There is so much of focus. The Air Force keeps talking about, they keep talking about space as though it's a war-fighting domain. We aren't there yet, and I hope we don't go that particular path, but there is certainly a sort of a greater momentum, at least in terms of the conversations and in terms of the awareness of the threats that are playing out in a sense. A DRDO capability to develop all of this, I think that I will take with a spoon of salt when they make these tall claims. After the ASAT test, the DRDO chairman at that time came out and said, we are developing an array of counter space capabilities, including electronic warfare, directed energy weapons, and so on and so forth. But that I would be a little bit more sort of careful in analyzing and seeing, are we there yet? Because it could be done with sort of inter-service rivalry, get more money from the government. There's a whole range of reasons as to why DRDO would make that claim. But I think the Indian government, certainly the Indian armed forces, seem to be much more into sort of how the Chinese counter space capabilities are playing out, and that is going to. But I think, again, there's been a lot of talk how that's converting into, you playing out various scenarios. One of your satellites get knocked out and kind of thing, and that has direct military operational implications. I don't think they are making that connection in terms of and playing out scenarios. I think scenario playing is such an important exercise to get a realistic sense of how these capabilities play out for you.
Raji, we're coming up on the end of our time, but I did want to get a question in from the audience. And this is specifically having to do with what might be red lines that you could see for India in China's growing nuclear arsenal. This relates very directly to the questions that have been raised already about, what would really push India into taking more rapid responses. Is there anything that you heard from your interviewees that was an obvious red line, so to speak, or something that they'd really be watching or would be alarming in a way that what's already happened maybe wasn't sufficiently alarming or would lead them to see the necessary need for a change?
Again, I think by and large, the Indian strategic community, which includes also the former officials, they seem to have certain amount of comfort that it is not going to go. China is not going to go overboard. China is somewhere a responsible power, responsible stakeholder. That label is still being attributed to China, which I'm not entirely comfortable with, and I don't think that is really China is playing all of us. And I think we need to get more serious about what the Chinese are doing in terms of capability. But it does China's nuclear expansion from 1,000 to 1,500 by 2035. I think that is going to be putting a lot of enormous pressure on India in terms of what it might do, because it's not just about nuclear at that point of time. Even 1,000 nuclear warheads for China, that already builds in certain amount of pressure in terms of even conventional capabilities. It might get India to think twice about how it might respond to a conventional scenario. If there has been an offensive from the Chinese side, how India might respond, that will also get India will play a much more careful, in a restrained manner, even on the conventional front, if there is a significant expansion of China's nuclear arsenal to even 1,000 warheads. So I think that's because we are not talking about nuclear. Because at least in the India-China context, we seriously have not really brought in the nuclear element in any of our conversation, even when there's a border confrontation that has involved casualties after 50 years and kind of thing. We still don't bring in the nuclear element. But again, there have been I think how it might play out, even in the conventional scenario, how it might close many of India's options, even in the conventional front. I think that's a serious concern for India. I think it's already beginning to have that effect in terms of how much India can play, how much India can respond in a conventional fashion, as sort of a limited offensive if India wants to do in terms of an air operation. Now, today, India might think twice, but I think it's going to bring in a lot more pressure on India if China's nuclear arsenal comes to 1,000 and, of course, later on to 1,500.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. And that brings us back, of course, to something that Bob was talking about the extent to which China may be developing, as he put it, a war-fighting capability and arsenal rather than a deterrence one. And
absolutely,
that India wakes up to that and sees that as a concern, it will change planning.
Yeah, that's an extremely valid point. I forgot to mention in the beginning. It is not exactly the political instrument that India generally adheres to or China talks about as well. It's becoming. China may have used that rationale at a very different point, and it made sense at that point. But today, that is not really the case, and I think India needs to wake up to that reality. Thanks, Bob, and sorry to intervene there.
Yeah, Bob, we're basically over time, but yeah, please jump in.
No. So that's why I don't believe they have a no first use policy, right? Because if you have a no first use policy, you don't need nuclear armed anti-ship cruise missiles, right? Yeah. I mean,
right. Well, on that note, I want to thank all of you, especially Raji, for your great report. I want to commend it to all of our viewers, and I want to also make a special thanks to all of my other colleagues at USIP, our editors, Brigitte Schukert, who helped out extensively to bring this project to fruition. As I hope all of you know, USIP continues to be a resource on all of these topics and related questions of peace and security. So again, please check out Raji's report on our website. Take a look at the other type of work that we're doing there. And one last time, thanks to all three of you for a fantastic panel. And I'll look forward to seeing you all in person very soon. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks so much.